So hello to all and welcome to today's webinar, a deep dive of the sector impacts and adaptation chapter of the National Issues Report. Today's event is the first of 4 webinars that make up our winter webinar series on the report. My name is Fiona Warren and I will be the moderator today. I'm the Knowledge Assessment Manager at Natural Resources Canada within the Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division, where we lead Canada's national assessment process. Claire Sanders at the Climate Risk Institute will be available during the webinar if you run into any audio or technical issues. To ask her a question, open the chat box and using the drop-down arrow, locate Claire Sanders and you can send her a private message. Please note that your microphones have been muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but that doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until then. Please feel free to type out your questions during the presentations in the Q&A box. Les présentations seront principalement en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser des questions dans anglais ou français. Aussi, les présentations sont disponibles dans les 2 langues sur notre site de web. We are recording the webinar today. We'll be sending out a link to everyone who's registered, along with a copy of the presentation slides. As a virtual event, we are gathered today across the traditional and unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. On behalf of those of us in the National Capital Region, I acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. I invite you to use the chat to enter your own land acknowledgement from wherever you are, if you wish. Now on to the report. The National Issues Report was released in June, and it focuses on climate change impacts and adaptation issues that are of national importance or that are best understood through an integrated pan-Canadian perspective. It clearly demonstrates that climate change is already affecting many aspects of our lives, that the impacts will persist and in most cases intensify, and that more action is urgently needed on adaptation. Like all of our reports, the full report is available at our website, changingclimate.ca. Today's webinar will focus on the Sector Impacts and Adaptation chapter, which examines key issues related to climate change, impacts and adaptation within 7 sectors in Canada: forestry, agriculture, fisheries, energy, mining, transportation, and tourism, as well as the status of corporate adaptation. I'm pleased now to welcome today's speakers, who are experts on these respective sectors and contributed to the chapter. First, I would like to introduce Catherine Lafleur, who is the coordinating lead author of the chapter and contributed to the forestry section. Catherine is a climate change specialist with a focus on forestry and capacity building and training. She had been working here at NRCan for many years and just recently moved to the climate change adaptation team at Infrastructure Canada. We will also hear from Denise Chabot, who is a research scientist specializing in ecophysiology at Fisheries and Oceans Canada and a contributor to the fisheries section. Next, Bruno Bussière will present on the mining section of the chapter. Bruno is a professor at University of Quebec, where he is the director of the Research Institute on Mines and the Environment. He is also the chairholder of the Industrial NSERC UCAT Chair on Mine Site Reclamation. Marco Braun also joins us today to present on impacts to the energy sector. Marco has a doctorate in physical geography and works at the Oranos Consortium, where he focuses on all issues related to climate change impacts on water resources and energy sector adaptation, as a member of Oranos' climate sciences team. Our final speaker today will be Maxine Bélideau, the Director of Climate Change Adaptation and Planning within the Environmental Policy Group of Transport Canada, whose team worked on the transportation section of the chapter. She leads on climate change adaptation policy for the department, including managing the Transportation Assets Risk Assessment Initiative. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to welcome all the participants and extend a warm welcome to Catherine, Jason, Denis, Bruno, Marco, and Maxine, and extend a big thank you for presenting the webinar for us today. It is much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to Catherine.
Thanks, Fiona. Can we proceed to the next slide, please? Right, so this is just an outline of where we're going. Like Fiona said, there'll be Q&A at the end. Feel free to type your questions in as they occur to you. Next slide, please. So to introduce the chapter, first I'd like to thank Don Lemon, who did most of the heavy lifting as the coordinating lead author along the way. I had the privilege of joining him partway through the process and working with him and learning from him. So thanks go out to Don for the heavy lifting portions. I'd also like to thank all the reviewers and contributors that make this whole adaptation assessment process what it is, makes it a much stronger and thorough process. So thank you to all the reviewers. And to my co-authors who are here today, many of them to speak. It's really great to have this opportunity to be part of the integration rather than just working in silos in our specific subject matter area. So the chapter on sector impacts focuses on these 7 sectors. So why these particular 7? These are what I consider the outdoor sports. So when you think about climate change adaptation, you think about your exposure and your sensitivity and your adaptation capacity. So you want to decrease your exposure and sensitivity while increasing your adaptive capacity. And the nature of these 7 sectors, as I call them, the outdoor sports, they're all exposed to the diverse climate and weather that we experience across Canada. So that's why these 7 became the key focus of this particular chapter. They also make up about 30% of Canada's GDP. But more than that, they provide products and services that Canadians rely on, as well as international. And they support many of the rural and remote communities that we have across Canada. Some of these are, single sector or, a couple of small sectors. So that's really important to the livelihoods and well-being of many of our communities. This chapter also complements information contained in the chapter on costs and benefits and climate disclosure. There'll be a cost and benefit webinar coming up on February 18th. And just a few of the quotes that are highlighted here, just to emphasize that climate change is impacting everyone. And because of that, the solutions should also be integrated and proactive. The more we can be proactive about adaptation and think of it as an investment rather than a cost will help us all to make progress moving together. Next slide, please. So the key messages throughout this webinar are mostly numbered in order that they're discussed in the chapter. It's not a prioritized list of key messages. And we have mixed up the order a little bit to accommodate the schedule of some of the co-authors who are presenting here today. So we won't go straight from number 1 to 9. So in key message number 1 here, climate change affects almost every economic sector in Canada. Some of them directly, some of them more indirectly. So if we start with the forestry, fisheries, and agriculture, not only are they these outdoor sports, but they're also dealing with living things. So it can directly impact the productivity and growth of these species within those sectors. Yet all of these sectors, they've been operating sort of outside all the time. So what's different now? They're used to adapting to these diverse weather patterns, but it's the pace of change and the degree of change that's now different. We're going outside of our regular climate envelopes. So we can't continue to do things the way we always have. In addition to that, we also have cumulative and cascading impacts. Living in the pandemic, as we are now, we all have a heightened awareness of supply chains. It's something that we take for granted until it's not working. We've seen recent examples in BC of climate impacts disrupting transportation and supply chains. And climate change can also shift with consumer demand. Real estate, we noticed this during the pandemic, that the demand for those rural and remote locations, people getting out of big cities, became a greater demand. And climate change can also cause shift in demand such as these. In addition to having a nice climate to live in, you also want to make sure you're in an area that you can get insurance on your new property. As we have changes and shifts in climate, demands for heating and cooling can change. And along this vein, we need to think about adaptation and mitigation together. So if there's greater demand for cooling, what can we do to supply that demand? Should we plant trees to reduce the urban heat island effect or install more air conditioners? And they have a different impact on the mitigation side of things. So we need to think about our options and what we do moving forward in an integrated way, considering both adaptation and mitigation. Next slide, please. Key message number 2 highlights things from the forest sector. So sustainable forest management has been challenged by wildfires and pest outbreaks, but also some slower onset impacts such as species composition, productivity, and health as the climate shifts. So as with most sectors, adaptation and mitigation are not considered in isolation. They need to be considered together to get the full picture. Sustainable forest management can really help mitigate against climate change. But in order to do that, we need resilient forests and forest communities. So the modeling has shown, as you see in the graph depicted on this slide, that fire risk is increasing across Canada. Within the chapter, you can see highlights of recent wildfire events, such as the Fort McMurray wildfire. A key takeaway from that is that impacts are not isolated to the forest sector. And there's a table in the report that shows both direct and indirect costs of wildfire. So some of the direct costs that seem more obvious are the fire suppression costs, evacuations, damages to building and homes, as well as the loss of timber. But there's also many indirect costs that come with these types of events. So losses to other businesses, in this case, oil production, loss of wages for people that had to leave and couldn't work, demographic shifts for people that leave and don't come back, the health and mental health costs, as well as increases to insurance rates. So there's both direct and indirect costs, and they go well beyond the forest sector. So Fort McMurray is just one example. It's highlighted in a case study in this chapter, but we continue to have more and more examples of this type of climate change impact. This summer, I was in BC visiting family, and I felt like I was on a climate change field trip. It's one thing to read and write about the impacts, and it's a whole nother thing to live it. So while I was there, people were doing what I would call reactive adaptation. They were filling garbage cans with water to help extinguish any sparks and placing sprinklers on roofs to help, mitigate against sparks flying over from the large fire. We saw the direct fire suppression impacts every day. There was a constant buzz of helicopters flying overhead. One afternoon, we spent watching a team of 5 planes fly down, scoop up water from the lake, and then circle over and dump it in the fire. And they kept repeating every 7 minutes until finally that afternoon it became too windy and the smoke got too thick and it was just too dangerous to continue. So we were very grateful for all the evacuation or for this fire suppression. And then we ended up being on evacuation alert, and we had offers of places to go. But it was a case of, well, you can't get there from here. So there was so much fire going on in the province this summer that where we were, we couldn't get to our offers for help and evacuation. So that's something that there's been work done in the forest sector and related sectors. So there's evacuation and culturally sensitive evacuation guidebooks that are being produced because Indigenous, and there's a bit on this in the chapter, are at a higher rate of evacuation. There's things that people are doing in terms of fuel management, cleaning up debris, adjusting harvest schedules and regeneration planning to include more fire tolerant species and more deciduous species. Communities are also working on fire smart initiatives and evacuation plans. And the insurance sector is working with some of these groups to try and help provide incentives. And there's also guidebooks that help specifically targeting the forest sector to assessing vulnerabilities and to rank your adaptation options. These range from large companies to private woodlot owners. Next slide, please. So when we think about adaptation, we want to be proactive and where possible, find some potential opportunities. So agriculture is one of those areas. There may be an ability to grow new different types of crops and to grow crops further north. However, there's always a flip side. With the warmer temperatures, there's also the potential for new pests and diseases. And in general, precipitation patterns have been projected to increase across Canada in many areas, but this is mostly offset by the increase in temperatures. So there will actually be a moisture deficit in many areas, as indicated here on the slide with the map, indicating the growing season moisture deficit, which greatly impacts the agricultural sector. The recent drought in the prairies this summer has been some of the worst in recent memories. So some of the adaptation actions that are being taken are a big focus on crop type and more resilient crops, as well as water management considerations. Agriculture also has many linkages across sectors, particularly with transportation, both to get supplies into the farming areas, as well as getting your products to market. Again, the recent flooding in BC is an example of transportation being impacted and impacting the agricultural sector. And grain supply and distribution is both for domestic and international markets can be greatly impacted by transportation. And that because Canada is an exporter, that can also impact the global food supply. So I'll now advance to the next slides and turn it over to Denis, please.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Denis Shabat. I'm a researcher for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And I'm here to talk about how global change will interfere with the health of our oceans, the nature of our marine ecosystems, and as a result, with our fisheries or fish farms and the associated livelihoods. Fisheries deal with ectotherm animals, more commonly called cold-blooded animals. So their temperature is about the same as the temperature of the water where they live. For these animals, a change of a few degrees in water temperature can have huge impacts on how their physiology, a term that means the functioning of their cells and tissues, is going on. All these species have a range of temperatures where they function well. We're a northern country, so most fish and invertebrates in the oceans are well adapted to cold water. And often they are functioning well only within a range of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. So sometimes an increase of 1, 2, 3 degrees is enough to bring them outside of the range of temperatures where they function well. A common effect of global warming on marine species is a reduction of abundance on sites that become too warm and a shift toward colder waters when this is possible. So that colder water may be available if animals go deeper or if they move further north. But just as some species were used to may move to colder waters, some species that considered the waters too chilly before may decide that now it's become acceptable and move into our waters. This can be good news. Some of these species may play a useful role in our ecosystems. Some of these species may be valuable species for fisheries, but some of these invasive species may also be detrimental to our ecosystems. And we show in the fisheries section of the chapter an example of an invasive species that took advantage of a heat event in the waters of British Columbia. And they were so abundant and they resulted in the fouling of fishing gear, which is not an effect of global warming that you might have expected, which means that we still have a lot to learn on the possible negative effects of warming. Another aspect of global change which will have an impact on our oceans is the acidification that you probably heard a lot of in the media. And many invertebrate species that build shells like oysters, mussels, and clams have already suffered negative impacts from the acidification that we've experienced so far. So we're not talking here of what will happen to them in the future. It's already happening now. So these species have more difficulty in building their shells the acidified water acts as a corrosive and makes it very, very difficult to build more shell and to maintain the shells that they've already built. And vertebrates with a carapace like lobster, crab, shrimp, and I will note that these are the three most valuable fisheries in the Atlantic, will suffer negative effects as well, with pH levels that are expected to be prevalent in our waters at the end of the century. Another environmental stressor that is expected to worsen by the end of the century is the so-called deoxygenation or hypoxia, or lowering of the amount of oxygen in water. Fishes and invertebrates need oxygen to be able to use respiration, just like terrestrial mammals. And when this oxygen becomes rarer, more difficult to acquire from the water, typical responses that we can observe in fishes and invertebrates are reduction in growth rate. And if it's too severe, actually, they can die of asphyxia. You may think that marine mammals are not going to be bothered by warming. After all, they have a constant body temperature, being mammals like us, terrestrial mammals. They also bring their oxygen with them when they dive. And in that you'd be correct. They will not suffer direct effects of warming, acidification, and hypoxia. However, they may suffer indirect effects if these same stressors influence the quantity of their favorite food items. So if their favorite food items become rarer or even disappear, and if the alternate prey they find is of a lesser nutritive or energy value, it will be bad news for marine mammals as well. In this short intervention, I tried to impress on you the fact that all aspects of our marine ecosystems will be touched, influenced by these global warming related stressors. And we have already started to see changes in abundance and distribution of our commercial species. And we think that this will continue and even accelerate. Our scientists are trying to anticipate how our commercial species and their prey will react to these stressors and use this knowledge to adjust our fisheries management strategies. In other words, we want to integrate environmental stressors more closely into our scientific advice to these fisheries. That's what I had planned to tell you. We can move to the next key message. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Thistlethwaite, and I am an associate professor at the University of Waterloo. And I will be brief going over my slide because that reflects the amount of research in the area that I worked on in the report. So I was charged with exploring the interface between climate change adaptation and corporations or the private sector at large. And so there's a few key messages that I wanted to highlight. First, we certainly do see increased private sector involvement in adaptation across various sectors. But for the most part, the evidence of what that behavior looks like is at the awareness level, rather than more robust forms of changes in practice. No widespread evidence of corporate adaptation in Canada. And typically, when we do see evidence of adaptation, it is often focused around short-term issues to address physical risks, such as disruptions in construction or interruptions in supply chain. And certainly the latter, we can see the adaptation happen in action, for instance, with the recent floods in British Columbia, through addressing, for instance, some of the rail interruptions and road interruptions. The main drivers for corporate adaptation include, for the most part, incentives associated with physical risk. And when there is evidence of physical risk, you do see awareness grow around among corporate stakeholders around the needs to adapt. Why is there so little involvement of the corporate sector in climate change adaptation? I think this is a good question. And I should say that the level of research on, or the amount of corporate engagement on adaptation in Canada is fairly consistent with what we see internationally as well. So it's by no means are we necessarily an outlier, but we could use some more research on exactly what the barriers are to corporate adaptation. And for the most part, they are the usual suspects. Businesses operate on very much a short-term time horizon, but also spatial horizon. If you are, most businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises, and we do need a lot more work around those. And they're going to have a much shorter time and spatial horizon compared to some of the larger public organizations that may be dealing with complicated supply chain issues. So that is key message number 9 on corporate climate change adaptation in Canada. Thank you.
Sorry, you can go to the next slide,
Next
please, for
slide.
the next speaker.
Thank you. My name is Bruno Bussière. I was one of the author of the chapter on the mining sector. My co-author was my colleague Émilie Bresson from Ouranos. Climate change can affect every phase of mine's life cycle, but recent studies that analyze the risk and vulnerabilities of the mining sector related to climate change showed that the physical stability of tailings containment and reclamation structures are the main components at risk. Indeed, these structures must remain in place for many decades and even centuries, which increase their vulnerability to climate change. Let's focus first on tailings storage areas. Tailings is composed of finely crushed rock and water. It's the initial rock that was taken from the ground and where the valuable metals or minerals have been extracted. Tailings are usually stored in pounds located at the surface, close to the mine. The purpose of these pounds is to contain the greatest possible volume of solid while allowing the management of the surface water. So given the high water content and the low density of most mine tailings, the physical stability of these structure is an important challenge for the mining industry for both the short and the long term. So current approaches to design tailings containment structure consider both average and extreme climate parameters, such as extreme precipitation events, that are based mainly on historical data, but the frequency and intensity of extreme precipitation events, as well as average annual precipitation levels, are projected to increase in most regions of Canada due to climate change, which will increase the risk of physical instability of tailings containment structures. So adaptation to climate change for mine tailings storage area will involve considering approaches that reduce reliance on dikes to retain large volumes of water and tailings bulk. This can be done, for example, by dewatering the tailings before deposition, or by using mine openings, such as open pits, as storage area. The other structure at risk with climate change are those related to reclamation. One of the major concerns at the closer stage of a mine is the contamination of the surface and groundwater by what is called acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage is a geochemical problem that appears when the sulfide mineral contained into the waste are exposed to meteoric water and atmospheric oxygen. To control acid mine drainage generation, different types of cover can be used to cap the mine waste. We have some example on the figure on the right. These covers usually aim at controlling water and oxygen availability, or to control the temperature of the waste. By controlling the temperature, we control the reactivity of the mine waste. So the long-term effectiveness of covers is affected by many factors related to the properties of the covering materials, the configuration and location of the site to be reclaimed, and also the climate. As the required life of reclamation structure is greater than 100 years, this is a stage of the mining cycle most likely to be severely impacted by climate change. While most governments now require proof that climate change has been considered in the design of any reclamation project, the lack of specific guidance on how to modify reclamation methods in the context of climate change remains a barrier to effective adaptation. So in summary, the longevity of tailings containment and reclamation structure increase their vulnerability to climate change. The physical and chemical stability of such structures is essential to avoid release of harmful contaminants into the environment. It is why we must develop tools and guidance for the different contexts from the south to the north to better enable designers to integrate climate change in the design of tailings storage area and reclamation infrastructures. So that's what I have to say as a summary for key message number 5. So now we can move on to the next key message.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Marco Braun, working at Uranos Consortium in Montreal. I was responsible for the energy sector chapter of the report. It's a pleasure to say a few words about energy sector impacts and adaptation, and maybe remind you, first of all, that the energy sector is an important component of the Canadian economy, accounting for almost 10% of our GDP. And on the other hand, it's at the core of close to all activity in a modern society, like Canada's. So if you take energy out of the equation, a lot of things may come to a halt, including essential services like water supply, health systems, food supply chains, and cooling. So in that sense, because of that importance of the energy sector, historically, energy systems have been designed to perform well under many different weather conditions in the winter and the summer, and extreme weather conditions. However, since climate conditions are now changing everywhere across Canada, all energy-related infrastructure faces changing risks, and that includes energy exploration, production, right through transmission and distribution. So to give you a few examples of how climate impacts the energy supply chain, think, for example, of thawing permafrost, which might destabilize building foundations, or it may increase the erosion and sedimentation of that thawing ground material. Rising sea levels and changing wave regimes put coastal infrastructure at risk. If we think of just plainly temperature, for example, electric conductor capacities are temperature dependent, so increased overall, but particularly extreme temperatures affect the transmission and distribution network. Changes in precipitation patterns in combination with increased evapotranspiration affect the hydrological cycle. And since we generate about 60% of our electricity in Canada from hydropower, that creates, well, either a risk or an opportunity depending on the changes of water availability for hydropower generation. And finally, the extreme events, Catherine talked about the events that we saw last summer, put at risk energy assets through floods, through storms, through hurricanes, and high winds. Another aspect of climate change and the energy sector is the energy demand. Warming temperatures, warming climate brings changes to electric energy consumption. As in the summer, we call for more electricity used for cooling, not only homes, but also equipment that operates only at certain temperature ranges. And warmer winters will reduce the need for space heating. Overall, over the whole year, that might not change the energy consumption per se, but there is this shift when the energy needs to be generated and provided. And the last point I would like to mention is as we're moving forward to, well, away from fossil fuels and towards a low carbon and carbon neutral energy landscape, providing energy from non-fossil renewable energy calls for a growth of electric generation from solar, wind, and biomass. And if you look at the little bar graph at the bottom right here, you can see that wind generation has increased and will continue to increase into the future. It has almost tripled over the last 10 years. And solar has also seen substantial growth in the past. In Canada, we have a great advantage given that we have a lot of hydro available, and it can play a key role in transitioning to a low carbon energy system as it provides stability for electricity grids as we integrate more volatile renewables such as wind and solar. And since we can ramp up hydro very quickly and bring it back down, it can stabilize the grids. As we transform to a low carbon energy system, it will be important to ensure that climate resilience is considered as we develop this new infrastructure and we build it according to a new climate. With all these, we arrive at the key message number 6, which is the fact that each link of the energy value chain can be vulnerable to climate change. Thank you. And next slide, please.
Here we go. That took me a few seconds to go on video. So hi everyone, bonjour à tous. I'm so happy to be here today and speaking to the transportation section of chapter 7. And so this was a section that was co-authored by my colleagues at Transport Canada. A call out to Irene Culture and Elizabeth Smalley, and who worked with Matt Osler of the City of Surrey in BC. I will mention this transportation section complements the report that was issued a few years ago called the Climate Risks and Practices for the Canadian Transportation Sector 2016 report. So great report, still very relevant. And for those that are interested, I do encourage you to check it out. I think we're beginning to understand that adaptation is a very complex issue, and our transportation systems are very complex. Transportation in Canada, it's a shared responsibility amongst the federal, provincial, municipal levels of government. Many stakeholders are involved, Indigenous communities and stakeholders, industry, and of course, geographically, Canada is vast. And remote and Indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable when the system isn't working efficiently. The key focus of this section of the chapter was on the interconnections that exist within the intermodal transportation systems and across a wide range of sectors, because as we've heard in the previous presentations, the transportation sector is critical to supporting others, health, agriculture, tourism. And overall, one key thing to note is that all transportation modes, air, surface, marine, are being affected by the changing climate, the increased frequency and intensity of weather events, slow onset changes, damage and degrade infrastructure, disrupt operations, and those disruptions lead to negative social and economic impacts. And we are already seeing this. We've heard mention the events in BC. And at that point, just I think one stat I'll share, I saw that at some point over 3 million people, 60% of BC's population after the mudslides and flooding in BC no longer had highway or rail access to the rest of Canada. So as a first step, climate risk assessments are necessary to identify, analyze, evaluate your risks. These form the basis for developing adaptation solutions. However, most risk assessments do tend to focus on individual direct climate impacts associated with specific assets. It's a good start, but this is an approach that underestimates the potential cascading risks and impacts from surrounding assets or networks, and vice versa. And as such, this really limits the results and the benefits. The chapter section provides a good City of Toronto example of this. Another challenge for the transportation sector that's noted in the chapter is that, as with many sectors, aligning technological advances with the long-term planning infrastructure life cycles involved in transportation infrastructure is a challenge. And it's not necessarily focused on in the report, but we also do have to think about co-benefits with mitigation and adaptation as well, as we look to really reduce emissions in the transportation sector. So to fully assess climate impacts and address some of these challenges, linkages between transportation systems and a wide range of other sectors and the supply chains and within the supply chains, these linkages need to be understood and accounted for. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about interdependencies. In developing the chapter, we were very lucky to work with the City of Surrey, and they provided a very motivating and interesting case study. The city, and of course, this was pre-fall 2021 flooding. And at the time, the risk they were looking at was quite specific, the risk of a major flood event due to sea level rise increases, which they knew would affect not only the residents of Surrey, but also the regional and national economy. From an infrastructure point of view, you're looking at your water and sewer lines, roadways, highways, their green infrastructure, their salt marshes and the wetlands. So the city tried a bottoms-up approach with multiple asset owners and undertook a collaborative assessment using the PIVC tools that many folks may be familiar with, the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee protocol, to develop a shared understanding of their collective climate risks. And at the time of the chapter's development, the identified next step was a long-term framework for asset owners to follow, with potential pathways that would allow for coordinated investments. The case study also emphasizes that asset management and renewal cycles are key opportunities to take preventative action. And that is also always a challenge with the sector, with the transportation sector. It's not only the extreme weather events, but the slow onset change that needs to be accounted for, balancing the need to respond to disasters while also doing that long-term planning for the future. So that case study, it's a very practical example of interdependencies that involved multiple asset owners. And led to a very, very good result. So in conclusion, there is a wide range of adaptation efforts that are underway in the sector. Transportation stakeholders are aware of the need to be able to account for the current and future climate. Jurisdictions are taking action. There is a broad range of work happening. But what we want to emphasize is that moving forward, that collaborative approach to adaptation in the sector is really quite critical to help asset owners and operators really better understand the range of risks that they face and the potential adaptation solutions at their disposal. And so that kind of collaborative approach that really accounts for those linkages and the interdependencies can help accelerate adaptation action, really bring on the transformative cross-cutting changes that are needed to prepare Canada for the future. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Maxine, and everyone for their bringing the chapter more to life with the words to go with it. So brings us to key message number 8, and that climate change is leading to transformational changes in tourism. This section of the report, well, it's another one that you can look at opportunities, and there are some potential opportunities in the tourism sector, but there's large regional differences across the country. So this particular section focused on winter tourism in this case, because it's one of the areas that's feeling the impacts sooner than others. So as shown in the photo here, one of these opportunities is Arctic cruise tourism. The decline in summer sea ice has allowed greater access, but like there's always a flip side, there's some risks associated with this. The short case story within this chapter talks about the search and rescue costs that were incurred by a tourism vessel in 2018. Another one of the opportunities could be this last chance tourism, where people are taking trips in order to see glaciers and polar bears while it's still possible. And it also examines a look at winter sports because they are particularly susceptible. So there's a graph in the chapter that shows how the number of projected ski days will decrease. And that's for downhill ski resorts that are already adapting by increasing their snowmaking capacity. So other sports such as cross-country skiing and snowmobiling are not able to adapt in that way. So far, a lot of the evidence of adaptation in the tourism sector is really at the company level, with a little bit at the destination level. But in the future, it's suggested that it could integrate more with sort of national and regional level climate adaptation planning. Next slide, please. So here's a few points to highlight some of the common themes that we have seen across these different sectors. So within the private sector, building on the key message number 9, that increased action in the private sector could move adaptation forward. We're seeing that, adaptation often consists of that local action, but it needs to be motivated by broader plans and strategies. It's really hard to change human behavior, particularly when it's like, do something hard now for a benefit in the future. So act now for a benefit that's in the future, and particularly when that benefit is something bad doesn't happen in the future. So I think human nature and human behavior needs to be taken in consideration as we come up with the right combination of these kind of carrots and sticks to motivate, in terms of regulations versus people seeing the benefit and cost savings of taking adaptation action. The second point here, just as COVID doesn't respect borders, neither does climate change. So we need to look at international perspectives and impacts. We've seen how COVID has disrupted supply chains internationally. Climate change has similar impacts. For Canada, we are large exporters in forestry, mining, and agriculture, for example. So we need to keep that international perspective in mind as we do our adaptation planning. And a key point that we've all been trying to make throughout the webinar is the interdependencies. So just like the chapter had separate authors for these separate sections, because we do need that sector specific knowledge, we also need to work together and help understand how the impacts in one sector actually have implications in many others. Like we've talked about forestry with impacts in oil and gas, agriculture, and transportation. So continued discussion and work to integrate those is something that's needed in the future. And cost benefit analysis comes down, back to motivating people to take action. So we need more examples that can show as proof to convince people that adaptation is a wise investment. So it's like a resilience insurance. There is a number of case stories included within this chapter, and there's also a case study map if you go to the changingclimate.ca. And you can search by keyword or you can search by region on the map. And that is an ongoing process. So it does contain all the case stories within the report, but it is continually being added to with more and more case studies. And for more on the cost benefit analysis, there'll be a webinar on February 18th. Next slide, please. So a few final thoughts before we get to the question and answer. So this chapter was written before COVID, before we realized that low probability, high impact events could actually happen, before we saw how these events impacted the most vulnerable, and before we realized how much we took for granted, before we'd ever used the term supply chain in a casual conversation. So what can we learn from this experience? And how can we apply that to climate change adaptation? Why do we need to adapt? Who are we helping when we are adapting and making things more resilient? When do we need to adapt? And by how much? Can we make incremental changes, or do we need something more transformational? The report concludes that adaptation is occurring at all sectors, but it needs to be faster and it needs to be more integrated. We need to integrate across sectors, across levels of the government, between public and private. We also need to integrate across adaptation and mitigation. This is not an either or, we need both to move forward. So what can we learn from the recent climate change impacts? Climate change is real and it's having widespread impacts. People are paying attention now. It's got the media's attention, it's got all of our attention. So this is an opportunity for us to drive change and to drive action. Next slide, please. So as we move into the question and answers, I just want to say that we don't have all the answers. We have knowledge and experience, but so do all of you listening. You don't give up your lunch hour on a Friday to listen to something if you don't already believe in it and have some skills and you have your own subject matter expertise and experience. So we will have a conversation here and answer some of the questions, but the key point is that we are all dedicated to climate change adaptation already, the panel and the listeners, the audience. And one thing we've learned from the pandemic is that the source of information matters. People need to hear things from a trusted source. So you are that trusted source for many people. So reach out to your networks and share your knowledge so that we can move together on adaptation. As many people have talked about, adaptation is a complex process. So it's more robust by including more people and more perspectives. It's important to get started with some questions. Asking the hard questions, we can lead to the answers together. So I'll turn it back to Fiona, and she can start moderating the question and answer session. And I encourage you all to take what you learned today and take what you've learned, over your combined years of experience to your networks and colleagues, and help keep the conversation going.
Well, perfect. Thank you very much, Catherine, for those inspirational words at the end. And I will reiterate, we do want to hear your questions. So it's easiest if you put them in the Q&A box. Before we get into them, though, first of all, I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of the speakers for your presentations today. They were interesting, informative, and really do demonstrate how climate change is impacting so many aspects of life in Canada. So just with that, I'm just going to ask the speakers to turn their cameras back on, if you don't mind. Perfect. Good to see everyone. And we have had a number of questions come in already, so I'm going to get started on those. But as I said, continue to answer the questions as they come to mind. So I'm going to start with a question for Bruno. That is, how do we prioritize long-term versus short-term adaptation needs that yield different results? For instance, mining for battery components is a short-term action needed to transition to a decarbonized society, but it takes place in environments with carbon stocking functions. So over to you, Bruno, then I'll open it up to others.
Okay. I think Catherine gave some part of the answer when she talked about the interdependencies of all this. And I think the example is related to mining, but I think there is another example where we can see that there is interdependency between the different sectors. So in this case, I understand that it's clear that if we want to reduce our gas emission, we'll have to go with technologies that are based on metals. So more metals mean more mines mean also probably more gases that are produced. So I think what is important to do in the future is to integrate all this and to be sure that we're not trying to solve a problem by creating another one that is bigger than the initial one. So, but I think interdependencies is clearly the key we have to make these links between the different sectors to have an overall view of any of our adaptation that we're proposing. So that's what I can say about this. Maybe my colleagues will have other things to say.
Great, thanks, Bruno. Does anyone else want to jump in on that in terms of prioritizing long-term versus short-term adaptation options? Catherine?
Sure, just say a few words. I think a lot of the sectors that we spoke about here today have their own kind of adaptation guidebook or a guidebook on, vulnerability and risk assessments. And they do walk you through that process of coming up with sort of a list of adaptation options. And then you can triage that list in terms of, what's more important to get done sooner and what's more at the end. So going through a systematic process and including as many people and, sometimes inviting what's called the unusual suspects who are implicated and have evidence and ideas to bring to the table, bringing, traditional and local knowledge. So being as far reaching in that process as you can so that you can gain as much intel. And then systematically going through so that some of these short-term actions, you can start with some of that incremental change. And in some ways, incremental change will lead to larger transformational change. But definitely something to keep in mind. And I keep coming back to the adaptation and mitigation. You want to see how your adaptation actions are going to impact your mitigation goals as well. So it really is a complex process and you need to do a lot of thinking and involve a lot of people along the way, but you'll end up with a richer product at the end.
Thanks, Catherine. Marco?
Maybe I'll try to chime in. I think from the experience of studying climate change impacts on different aspects, we often come across more knowledge of what we actually need to address. And one of the things that we've seen in the energy sector many times was that depending on if it's a short or long-term goal, you can implement different approaches to the adaptation. And one of the maybe buzzwords even is the incremental adaptation, where you start small and adapt to the changes that you might see within the next decades, and you think big or long term in terms of the changes that we're going to see in 50 years or towards the end of the century. That's one idea, and the other is kind of to study what you're facing, and I would like to maybe quote one of the comments that we had one time from one of the interviews we did, where the manager said, well, we have looked into things and we decided it's not necessary to act right now. But then she said, if you don't adapt now, then you have to know why. So an important thing is to look into what the issues really are at hand.
Thank you, Marco. Okay, I think I'm going to move on to the next question, and this one is for Jason. And a participant is wondering what you think about the impact of ESG reporting in the private sector. ESG reporting has really gained some traction in the past decade, but do you think this is accurately capturing climate adaptation metrics?
Good question. Probably not. Businesses consider adaptation to be different things. So you may see businesses taking into consideration adaptation in enterprise risk management or just risk management frameworks. ESG may not be asking to report on that. I'd say the primary way that a business is thinking about adaptation would be in their business continuity planning, which wouldn't necessarily be something an ESG report may capture. And more broadly, while reporting is something it's great, it doesn't necessarily reveal any information on whether anyone's doing anything about what they're reporting in terms of concrete action. So those would be my thoughts on the ESG question.
Thanks, and hopefully that answered the question for the participant. I think for the next question, we'll go to one that we received in advance of the webinar, and that's concerning specifically impacts in the north. So could you speak, and I'm going to direct this first, I think, to Maxine. Could you speak specifically about impacts in the north and the opportunities for the region? And sorry, just before I pass it to Maxine, I want to let everyone know that we're also leading a regional perspectives report. And that report includes a chapter focused specifically on Northern Canada, and that should be coming out in the spring this year. So anyways, Maxine. Thanks.
Sure, I can speak briefly to, of course, the transportation systems in the north are seeing the impacts of climate change right now more acutely. The needs are there. And so for Transport Canada, we've been investing in adaptation up in the north for the last decade through our Northern Transportation Adaptation Initiative. And it was really, and that was a program that really focused on, first of all, that building the adaptive capacity in the north and working with stakeholders up there to share that knowledge, build that capacity, have on-site project visits, working with researchers and academics, and really working to understand the change that's happening in the north, the pace of change in the north. And we were able to pilot some innovative adaptation technologies in the north as well on transportation. But and there continues to be a lot of interest and work into winter roads, seasonal roads. We know that there's a great need there. Our National Trade Corridors Fund also has funding set aside specifically for the north. That said, we know the need for investment and further research is huge. I will leave it at that to allow others to chime in if they'd like.
Thank you, Maxine. Anybody else? Okay, then we'll move to our next question. And I think this one is for, what should I go to next? Before Marco. So how can we better ensure that climate resilience is considered appropriately and meaningfully in infrastructure design?
Did you say Marco? Sorry. Well, I think one of the key things is that the understanding of climate change and the understanding of the problem is at the basis. So informing people or getting informed of what's actually happening, sensibilization, training, and evaluation of impacts. And based on that, we can prepare and start analyzing the options and finding the solutions for adaptation. It's basically what we often describe as the adaptation cycle. And once this preparation has been put in place, an adaptation action can be put in place and then monitored and adjusted in order to adapt appropriately to climate change.
Great, thank you, Marco. Maxine, do you have input on that question in terms of climate resilient infrastructure and how to incorporate it into the design?
Well, I think I will just add that there is a lot of work happening in this space, and Infrastructure Canada, and working with National Research Council and Standards Council of Canada on really looking closely at codes and standards in this space. What are the needs for updates to technical guidance, documents? There is a lot of work to be done, but there is work being done. It's my brief overview answer.
Great, thank you, Maxine. Okay, so on to the next question. Just trying to keep track here of which ones we've done. For Catherine, what are some examples of adaptation approaches being used to reduce the risks of forest fires? And what barriers do they face in terms of implementation?
Great. Thanks, Fiona. That's a very timely and challenging question. First, just want to say, the forest fires are a natural part of the cycle of life in a forest. So the challenge becomes when, the fires become too frequent and when they're close to, to humans, to our civilization and our infrastructure. So some of the things that are being done, there are fire smart guidebooks and agencies across Canada that are encouraging communities to do things like the fuel management, cleaning up debris, creating fire breaks between, forests and, communities and essential infrastructure. There's also things that forest companies are doing in terms of shifting harvest cycles and doing the scan on their forests. So shifting if there's a drought infested area or a pest infested area, doing a proactive logging of that because those are at higher risk of fire. So there's a lot of tools out there in terms of looking at fire risk and then adjusting practices and making it safer for humans that are in that immediate area. And there's also can be a shift in, your philosophy in terms of, do we extinguish all fires, or, when fires aren't threatening something, do we let them burn? And there's some work being done on sort of Indigenous burning and cultural burning and letting that take place. So part of it is the knowledge and the know-how of what you can do, and part of it is that the behavioral and cultural shift on what we should be doing. And, this has been going on for years, but of course, climate change is causing conditions to have those more frequent fires. So we need to revisit what our perspective is on attacking this issue that, as I've spoken to, definitely impacts multiple sectors. This is not just a forest sector issue.
Great, thank you, Catherine. And so in terms of barriers to adaptation, I'm wondering if anyone else wants to chime in what barriers they identified would be challenges to adaptation within the sectors in their section of the chapter. So Denis, would you have any comments from the fisheries perspective?
I'm having a bit of a hard time finding the equivalent of fires in the fisheries world. I suppose in the sense that fires are extreme but short-lasting events. The example we gave about the heat blob in our chapter is maybe analogous to fires, and that had the effect of changing the zooplankton community, that had the effect of having made the area favorable for the arrival of an invasive species that was interfering with fishing gear. But in terms of barriers that might offer some protection for wildfires, it's a bit difficult to see the equivalent in the fisheries world. Maybe for fish farms, it is a bit more relevant. Maybe fish farms can choose their location carefully to have some protection against some of the effects of global change, like avoiding areas where the risk of having influx of waters that would be poor in oxygen, for instance. These influx of hypoxic waters could kill most of the fish in a farm. So by choosing the location of fish farms, by choosing the species that are raised, not just about commercial values, but about the tolerance of the many possible species to the environmental conditions that are present now, but are likely to be present within a few tens of years. So by taking mitigation measures like this, maybe we have the equivalent of wildfire barriers.
Thank you, Denis. Okay, the next question is I'm going to start with Jason. What proactive measures do you think the insurance sector can take to mobilize adaptation action in Canada?
Sure. So I'll begin with what they could do, explain why they won't, and then what's more feasible. They could do things like raise premiums on greenhouse gas emitting sectors. They could raise premiums on very high risk areas as a signal to government to ramp up investment in risk mitigation. They could divest from greenhouse gas emitting sectors as well. We've seen some European firms do this, so getting out of coal, not even offering insurance to coal-fired power and mines and whatnot. In Canada, of course, we have a much more robust greenhouse gas emitting sector than a lot of the European countries. And there are a lot of fiduciary barriers that the sector runs into to try and take on those types of activities. So a couple, influential things that they could do that I would suggest. One is use their data. So as we've noted throughout the report and elsewhere, we need more data on the way that climate change is going to influence risk in Canada, and the insurance industry has a lot of that. For the most part, it's largely proprietary. They don't like sharing it with government or between each other, but they could certainly be using data, putting out maps, creating tools for property owners to be able to understand and be aware of their own risk. And lastly, they can lobby government. They're a big sector. And I think one of the major takeaways from, I'd say broadly, sort of my experience working in the private sector on adaptation, but also just adaptation more broadly, is that if the government isn't going to set an example by doing adaptation on its own, I wouldn't expect other sectors to do the same. And in Canada, I think one of the lessons out of the pandemic that we sort of saw is we really do have an adequate state capacity. And that is in my opinion, a major barrier to more profound levels of adaptation throughout the country. The countries that we saw that did well or better during the pandemic had the emergency management, had the digital tools, the data tools available to them to be able to mobilize resources and tackle problems. And I think it's something that we need to take a good hard look at in Canada if we're going to be serious about adaptation.
Great, thank you, Jason. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that question? Okay.
I can add a few comments, Fiona. I think we're talking about barriers still.
And
oh, did we move on from that?
We did move on, but I've lost the question now. Where did it go?
It was a specific question to Jason, but I did just want to jump in to kind of echo some of what I'm seeing too in the comments on the side in terms of barriers and kind of where we can move to. Definitely a need for tools to support the decision making, to make the decision to take preventative adaptation action in the first place. And then, yes, across the board, transparency on climate risks is moving us towards that. And then from a state perspective, I think a lot of departments, Transport Canada, among them, are learning a lot of lessons from the pandemic and really looking at mobilizing the sector for these types of disruptions. This was something no one could have foreseen, but leveraging it for those lessons learned. And that can certainly be applied to extreme weather events and climate events in the future. Thanks. Sorry, Fiona, go ahead.
Thanks, Maxine. Okay, I think I'm going to direct the next question to Bruno. And maybe two questions actually for you, because I think one of them will be relatively fast. And the first is, within the mining sector, are you aware of any publications or recent projections that profile the rise in temperature being experienced within the actual underground mine environment?
Well, the answer is no. So it's relatively short because, an underground mine is a disturbed environment. So we control the environment by sending, we're using ventilation, we control temperature sometimes. So it's not the best place to monitor the impact of the climate on the underground environment. But this has been said, the mines that are located in the north, usually they monitor the temperature of the ground at different to see the evolution of the temperature with the evolution of climate. So we try to make link between the evolution of the climate and the condition where the mine has to work. There is a sensitivity of the mine that operates, especially in the north, because it evolves more rapidly than in the south. So they are aware that this could have an impact on how they are working, how they are exploiting their mines. So there are a lot of measurements that are made they are measuring on site because of that. So directly to the question, no, because that's not necessarily the best place to make the measurements. But if the question is expanded to what they are doing to understand the evolution of the ground temperature, yes, they are measuring and they are trying to use a model eventually to predict what would be the evolution of the permafrost, because the active zone is an important part of when you want to project what would be the behavior of a mine waste in the long term. The thickness of the active zone, the zone that freezes and thaws every year, is very important. So they are interested to know what will happen in 100 years, 200 years, to see if the design of their structures will resist to the years considering the climate change.
Thanks. And I think you actually answered the second question in that as well. So yeah, you provided, unless you had like to further elaborate on what changes would help the mining industry to reduce its environmental risks related to climate change.
Yeah, in the north and even in the south, I think we know that we will have to face more important and extreme events. And for some technologies, we're at the limit probably of what they can bring to the operators. So I think in many cases, we have to change completely the technology. So changing from using dikes and tailings with a lot of water to other technologies that will reduce the risk when we have extreme events. So I think that's where we have to go. We have to work, I would say, upstream. So we have to try to work and to change the way we're mining our ore bodies in order to use technology that are less at risk with climate change. So, and I think the mining industry is clearly moving in that direction now. The main challenge is for the actual mines that have already structures that are in place. So how you can manage, adapt with climate change, not as easy as when you plan to have a mine in the future where you can put the new technologies on the table and see if they are less at risk for against climate change than the old one. So I think it's where we have to work. It's to work more upstream, generating less waste, using technologies that are less at risk. And I think we're moving in that direction, but we still have an history and we still have some structures that maybe were not built to take that into account a few years ago.
Thanks very much, Bruno. The next question is for Marco, and it's, do we have any projections for impacts on hydro generation capacity?
Yeah, I've seen that question. That's a good question. I will interpret it as asking if the climate will impact the capacity, not the question if new hydro will be added to the park. Yes, we do have information on that. I'm not aware if we have this for the whole of Canada, but maybe I can speak for from some of the experience we had in Quebec studying the water availability. As I tried to mention in my presentation, it's a trade-off between more water from precipitation and more loss through higher temperatures. So it's a bit of a complex issue, and it depends very much on where you look. For example, in southern Quebec, both will be pretty much offset. There will be more precipitation, but also more evapotranspiration. So net, it's going to be remaining pretty much the same. But in some other areas further north, there may be some of the projections say, well, actually many of the projections say that there will be more water. That actually means an increase of the capacity. But again, that might be different elsewhere. Maybe drawing from an example from Iceland that might be relevant for the west of Canada. As glaciers melt, that actually adds water to the system. And in Iceland, they have actually been installing additional capacity in order to harvest that additional water, to turbine that additional water. Hope that gives some idea to that question.
Great, thanks very much, Mirko. I think the next question I'm going to direct to Catherine. It says, is anyone looking at enhancing adaptive capacity through improving organizational capabilities and behavior?
Thanks, Fiona. So there are a number of sort of training and capacity building programs out there. Like I referred to before, most of the sectors have their own guidebook, but the guidebook is only useful if you have people that can implement it. So I've done some work on the BRACE program through Natural Resources Canada, so building regional adaptation capacity and expertise. And one of those projects developed a climate adaptation competency framework. So it talks about the different types of skills that people need to know in order to adapt and implement some of these adaptation actions. So some of those are what you'd consider maybe soft skills in terms of communication and collaboration and that sort of thing, because as we've all been talking about, you need to bring a number of people together to get all the different perspectives and the information that you need. And then some of them are more the hard sector specific skills. So there's a number of case studies that are going on right now, looking at different training programs and different applications of that competency framework and seeing how that can be improved. So there's definitely work going on in the area, and there's a greater realization, I think, across sectors that we need to adapt. Therefore, we need the people that know how to adapt. And so the different programs some of them are focused on interns and students, and others are focused more on professionals that are already mid-career or even late career, and they have that sector-specific technical knowledge, but they need to know more about adaptation and climate change.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Anyone else interested in weighing in on that question? Okay. So the next question is for Jason. And there's a bit of a preamble, but I think I'm going to jump right to the question just in the interest of time. That is, was the financial sector looked at, especially in terms of sustainable and green investment options, increasingly being available to investors?
I didn't look much directly at them. There is a section on finance in the report, though. So I would recommend you looking towards that. What I can say from some colleagues in my department who do work a lot on, green finance and those finance options, and particularly green bonds, is we need to ensure when those products become available that the funds that are being put into them for investment purposes actually go towards the goal of climate mitigation and adaptation, right? You can have a lot of projects that can be funded under the auspices of some of those financial instruments that don't do very much for adaptation primarily, or mitigation, which is largely what they're designed around, right? So, they can be used to build things like infrastructure and roads that have very little, impact, for instance, on the climate. So that would be my 2 cents there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And maybe, sorry, just real quickly, I'm just going to ask maybe Julia from my team could post the link to the climate disclosure, litigation and finance chapter in the chat for more information. But Maxine?
I was just going to add to that, one of the commitments that was made in the last federal budget was to issue Canada's first green bonds. this year, and in fact would be the first North American green bonds. And so that's something to stay tuned about.
Thank you again to the presenters and for everyone for joining us today. And I wish you all a great weekend. Thank you.